Hello, welcome to Plot with me. My name is Colin, and this is the site where I take you around bits of London and tell you a bit about their history. And today we're going to finish off our wander around Spitalfields with part 3, and we're starting off where we finished off in part 2, and that's in Puma Court. So, when I just spin around, you can see that we have a sign up here. And it says, these almshouses were erected in the year 1860 for poor inhabitants of the liberty of Norton Folgate, in place of those that were built in 1728 and lately taken down for the new street. So basically, the new street was a commercial street, which is where you can see all the traffic going past there, and it was sort of widened and developed in the 1800s to make way for all the traffic coming up from the docks and bringing the goods up to the market and beyond. And the Norton Folgate Liberty was an area of 9 acres, and as I've mentioned before about liberties, they were areas attached to like religious institutions where you were outside the sort of the jurisdiction of the usual laws. So if you were accused of murder or theft or bigamy or any number of things, then you were safe as long as you stayed within the bounds of the liberty. And so we're starting in the liberty of what was Norton Folgate, which I believe was in existence until the year 1800. So these almshouses, as it says, were built to make up for some of the houses that were knocked down, but by no means would they have made up for all the houses that were knocked down. As I mentioned before, around this area it was very overcrowded, very crammed, and it would seem the council's idea was that they would knock down the houses and everybody would just move away, and then that would ease some of the overcrowding, which of course didn't happen. What happened was all the people that were there just had to cram into the space that was left, and the houses that were left, and things got even worse. But that is the inspiration behind these almshouses. Very pretty as they are, and I'm sure they're very nice to live in, close to the market and central London. So we're going to nip around. It's going to start getting noisy now because of all the traffic, lots more people. So the next point of interest is the 10 Bills pub, which for anybody that's fascinated by the Jack the Ripper story, this is sort of central to that. The second victim, Annie Chapman, she was drinking here the night before she died, and Mary Jane Kelly, the final victim, who lived just across the way, her pitch as a prostitute was just outside here. So that's why it sort of plays a central part in sort of what is now the mythology almost of the Jack the Ripper and trying to figure out who he was. So if I step over here into the shade, and we can take in this one. Scroll up, and here we have Christ Church, Spitalfields. So Christ Church was built in 1729. I'll see if I can move away a bit from the crowd. Well, as I say, it was built 1729. It was part of a scheme called the 50 Churches Act. So in 1711 there had been a decision to try and build a lot more churches, and part of it was to show these all these foreigners coming over what a proper church should look like. So if you compare this one, which is very large, very imposing, compared to The one at the other end of Fournier Street that we looked at in part two. You compare it to that, or the synagogue, which was previously a church that we looked at in part one, in Sandys Row. This is much bigger. And basically this was making a statement to all these people with their, they had their own faiths that they brought with them. But essentially this was the British saying, well, our God is bigger than your God. And an easy way of saying that is to build a much more impressive church. And this one was built by a guy called, or designed by a guy called Nicholas Hawksmoor. He was a disciple of Christopher Wren, and he only built a handful of churches. I'm not sure if that's because he died or whatever. I'll have to look into that. But there is a lot of mythology about Hawksmoor. I was reading a book just called Hawksmoor, but there has been this sort of myth that he was into, mystical things, and his churches are filled with Masonic symbols and all the rest of it. And it's been sort of postulated and then sort of grown, but I'm not sure how much there is to it. As well as that, if you look at the 6 churches that he built across London and you would draw lines between them, it becomes a pentagram, which is a satanic symbol, and all that sort of stuff. And that's why Jack the Ripper was drawn to this area. And basically it's what I would sort of gently call woo-woo. Lots of sort of mysticism and hot air, which I'm not really into. But that is Christchurch Church. In the 1850s, it was, it was in a really bad state. In fact, there was even talk about knocking it down by the mid-1900s. And then it was saved, and then it was renovated according to its original design inside in the 1990s. So if you wanted to see a 300-year-old church as it would have looked relatively new in its day, then this would be the place to come. Because as I say, it was renovated in the style that Hawksmoor described. So, that is Christchurch, Spitalfields. Across the way, we're going to go into the market. I might have to put on my own music because a number of the market stalls tend to pipe music out, and YouTube doesn't like that sort of thing. So I'll take you for a quick wander around the market before we move on. But the market's obviously a historical thing. It got its charter in 1682 from Charles II, the sort of fruit and veg and roots market. And then this was built, this particular building was built, I think it was 1875. Rebuilt by Robert Horner, 1887 it says up there. I'm sure the original was 1875, maybe it was sort of announced 1887. But anyway, Robert Horner had been a porter, and then he ended up, running the whole thing and building this building. And then in 1991, the market moved out of the area, the fruit and veg thing, and 2/3 of the market, and maybe 3/4. Whenever you walk around it, you can see it's all office blocks now. But basically, there was an arrangement made with the developers that part of it would still be kept as a market, and so it's like a flea market now. So I'll take you a wander around, but as I say, I may have to pipe my own music. So here we go. that gives you a flavour of Spitalfields markets, but certainly not all of it, but it gives you an idea. Now we're going to nip around to the left here, but just up before we go, dead ahead, you can see it says Truman's, the Golden Heart pub, and believe it or not, the landlady in that pub was there was a survey a few years ago to do with like the most influential people in British art, and the landlady of that pub was in the top 50. And as I mentioned before in the earlier videos, Spitalfields traditionally has had a lot of artists stay there because it was cheap. Lord knows it isn't now, but back 60s, 70s, 80s, it was a cheap place to live, and a lot of them would have drank in this pub, and then she would have introduced them to each other, and then obviously they influenced each other. So yeah, bit of a novelty fact. This is Elder Street, and this is thought to be one of the finest streets for Georgian architecture in London. Right, let's try that again. So one of the reasons this street is still here is because of the effort of a number of people. Probably the one who's the most prominent since is a guy called Dan Cruikshank. Back in the 70s, all this was going to get knocked down and redeveloped. Cruikshank and a number of his friends basically squatted in the houses and fought for them to be preserved so that people could rebuild them or sort of regenerate them as they have now. And that's why it's such a lovely street with all these lovely old-fashioned houses. Cruikshank went on to become a sort of historian and documentary maker. Does a lot of very good documentaries on London history, so well worth a watch if you ever see him. And he lives on this street now. Now this house, as it says up there, Mark Gertler, painter, lived here 1891 to 1939, and Gertler was a pacifist, and he lived here, and in one of his more famous paintings is up in Tate Britain, not Tate Modern, but Tate Britain, and it's some soldiers on a carousel, which you can see here on this coal hole cover. And it was also represented in sort of film form in the movie Oh What a Lovely War. If you ever watch it and you see them all on the carousel, that was the inspiration behind it. It's all based on his painting. coffin fits. So, yeah, he lived here till 1939. As I say, pacifist. I think a couple of his friends died in the lead up to the war, and then I think he had been diagnosed with tuberculosis and his days were numbered, but he gassed himself and died here. Now, if you want to make the argument that certain places attract, creative types, I suppose this would be as good a place as any, because more recently, certainly in the 90s onwards, this was the atelier, or sort of master craftsman's workshop, of a famous designer called Timothy Everest. And so he would have done the outfits for like Tom Cruise and the initial sort of Mission Impossible movies, and Pierce Brosnan when he was starting to do Bond and that sort of thing. And this was where he trained people, and I suppose where they would have come for their fittings, unless he got flown out to see them. But they're just a couple of the big names. Lots of people wear his stuff, and now he has moved his workshop up to Marylebone, which is probably even more plush than Spitalfields these days. So that's the history behind that house. Just thought I'd mention this building. I'll scroll up. This is what's known as Dennis Seaver's house, and it's basically an immersive art exhibition. I'll go around the corner and tell you about it. Because otherwise we're going to get the other conversation. So, yes, Dennis Seaver's house. It was essentially, or it is, the guy standing outside taking money for tickets. It's an immersive art exhibition, and each level of the house has been decorated in the matter of a different time period, ranging from 1700s up until just before the First World War. And so you'll get, the sort of rooms where the masters of the house, the family that owned it, would have lived. For other rooms, a different time period is where the servants would have lived, and obviously nowhere near as plush. And the whole idea is you wander around the house in silence, and you'll hear sounds like it sounds like a family was maybe just having a chat in the next room. There'll be smells, there's lots of food, lots of artifacts to see. The artist David Hockney described it as being like a great opera. Personally, I went a few years back. Did quite enjoy it. I thought it was a bit expensive for what it was, but I did quite enjoy it. But probably part of it was spoiled for me by the two American ladies who decided to walk around it speaking very loudly the whole time and not appreciating the idea of silence and just trying to take it all in. So, so that is Dennis Seaver's house, and if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's in a place called Folgate Street. Now, we're near the end. And again, you know, that must have been a marvellous house, you know, the steps leading up into it. Obviously this one's a bit more recent, maybe a victim of the Blitz, who knows. So we're getting near the end now, and this is where, whenever I'm taking groups of people around, this is where I explain to them that they've got to use a bit of imagination. I do have pictures, but I can't really show them on here because of copyright. When I say pictures, it's an artist's impression. So essentially, we stand here, and I show them an artist's drawing of what used to be here. If you'd been standing here 500 years ago, you would have saw big church, which was the priory of St Mary's Spital, and there would have been a lot of outbuildings and, you know, buildings attached to it where people would have stayed, as well as the patients of the hospital. So it was all in front of us here. Looks a bit different now, but this was the location of the priory, and as such there was another important feature of the priory which took place nearby, and I would suggest that took place just over there, because there was an annual event. Now it would have taken place a lot of the year round, but annually there was a big event called the Spital Sermons, and that was where the great and the good from up in the city of London, including a young Queen Elizabeth who came with an entourage, would have come up to hear the Spital Sermons being announced. And it was a fundraising thing for the church, where they would come up here and no doubt tell people, you know, it was about easier to for a camel to get through the eye of a needle and for a rich person to get into heaven, because they were trying to get money out of them for the hospital and the church. And they would do these big sermons. And as I say, they were a big event, so much so that the Mayor of London, he actually built a house nearby, just so that he could come up and see them, you know, and attend. And they still go on to this day, despite the pulpit having been destroyed after the priory was destroyed. The sermons still go on an annual basis, but they now take place up in St Lawrence Jury at Easter. And so 500 years after the hospital and the priory has long gone, the tradition of the sermons carries on. Now, we're just going to do one more thing, and then that will be the end of this one. And for this next bit, if it's open, we're going to go downstairs. So this is the crypt of the crypt of the chapel of St Mary Magdalene and St Edmund the Bishop, built in about 1320. So this is what's left of it, and as you can see, it's underneath, because this is the story of London. Most of the history of London is underneath our feet. We still get to see some bits jutting up above the ground, but most of it is underground. But as it says, this is from 1320. And there is what I would say is like the official biographer of London these days. There's been several throughout history, and the current one is a guy called Peter Ackroyd. If I just spin that round, I'll just explain. So what he's got a number of books about London. Probably dozens of them. But he's got one big tome called London, and the very last page is set here. because as the process now, whenever developers want to develop a piece of London, the archaeologists get in first, have a look, see what's there. If there's anything more preserved, then they preserve it, and then the developers build over it. And when they were developing this place, there was obviously the famous Roman casket of a sort of a rich lady, um, dating, I think that was from the 4th century. You had stuff from the priory here, like this from the sort of 12 and 1300s. There was stuff from the 1500s, from because the artillery grounds nearby, the 1500s, sort of bits where people have been doing the shooting at the artillery ground. There was fortifications from the 1600s and the Civil War, and then they found sort of 1700s and 1800s, they found evidence of pavements and streets. And even part of the gallery for the Spital servants in the 14th century, they found evidence of that. So what he was showing was London's like underneath our feet, there's layers of history, and it's all there, and we just happen to see bits of it up above. But I had to walk down these steps just to see this bit, which was previously, I suppose, ground level. Well, I suppose this is the crypt, but even so. So, um, that is the end of this walk. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like these, please, hit the subscribe button. If you know somebody, who will never be able to get to London and would like to see a bit around it, let them know. All right. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll watch the next one. And hopefully, I'll see you then. Bye.